Hi, Luke Wanick here at Brenly Farm near Camrose, Alberta. And this is the second of 3 videos on how to plant a wetland buffer, how to implement a tree planting project. I'm walking you through our process here. In the last video, we covered site assessment, the first step of our process. And in this video, we're talking about how to develop a design and then how to source your stock. So when developing a design, a good tree planting design should answer 2 questions. What am I going to plant and where am I going to plant it? Both of these questions, the answers to both of these questions should be kind of a compromise between your goals as a land manager or landowner and your site conditions. Finding kind of a compromise between those two. So in terms of what to plant, well, typically for wetland buffers like this, we recommend focusing on native species as much as possible. Native species, well, they're adapted to this environment, they tend to be, and they also have a lot of different species around them that have evolved with them and they're therefore adapted them. So they have great wildlife value and they can provide many different kinds of functions. And in terms of how you figure out which native species would be appropriate, well, the Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society has put together a list of trees and shrubs native to the different ecoregions of Alberta, the aspen parkland, the grasslands, the foothills, and things like that. And it's available on our website, and you can go and kind of input your site conditions, and the kind of the goals or characteristics you're after, and then it'll spit out a list of different species that could be relevant for you. So that's one way of doing it. And another way is just to go around to similar environments, maybe similar healthy wetlands, and see what's growing there, and then trying to get that stock. I've been talking about trees and shrubs here, but herbaceous species, so non-woody species like grasses and wildflowers, rushes and cattails and things like that, they're also really important to wetlands and wetland buffers. But we tend not to focus on them so much, at least in my experience, because they tend to grow back pretty well themselves. Like in this wetland here, we see that there's already cattails and rushes growing back with little intervention on our part. Sometimes in severely degraded sites, you may need to see them back in, or you may need to focus on herbaceous species more if there's particular goals you're after, like you're trying to provide pollinator habitat, so you get a lot of wildflowers in there. But in this case, we were focusing more on trees and shrubs for the most part, although we do seed in a ground cover anywhere that we till up for planting. So any part of it, the site that we serve, we make sure we seed that back in to a ground cover afterwards. So yes, that was the first part, was what do we plant. The second question that any good design should answer is where do you plant it. And so I talked about in the last video how a good thing to keep in mind with planting around wetland buffers is to start from the edge of the high water line and work your way up from there. And that just keeps your seedlings from getting flooded out in their first year, as I mentioned in the last video. So that's a good place to start. And you can use, we have a software, or it's called a Geographic Information System program we use called Google Earth Pro. And it's available for free online. And using Google Earth Pro, you can draw out lines or areas that you're planting, and it'll automatically calculate like the size of them, so you can figure out, you can start to calculate how many seedlings you're going to need, and just have a good aerial view of your planting project, which is really useful. So to do those calculations of figuring out how many seedlings would go in your planting areas, it's also, you need to know what's your spacing going to be between seedlings and which species are going to go in, so you can figure out what to order. And there's many different ways of going about this, many different designs you can follow. In this case, when we're trying to create more of a natural forest-like system, so it looks like just like a natural native forest stand or strip of forest, one design pattern we also use is the eco buffer. And an eco buffer is typically planted in lines. It's kind of modeled after a shelter belt or windbreak style design. But instead of a sort of one species, one row, like in a shelter belt, you have a single row of completely only white spruce. In an eco buffer, it's a mishmash of different species along the rows, mixed in together, one after the other. And you get different heights and growth tolerances and characteristics within those rows. And things are planted quite densely, 1 meter spacing between each one, and then it's typically 2 to 2.5 meters between rows. to get a solid eco buffer. And within those rows, there's not too much concern with getting the exact place of different species right, except, well, in this case, we tend to favor more wet-loving species on the inner rows here, so that we could make sure that they were, if the area did get flooded at all, they could handle it. And then the other thing we wanted to make sure, and we tend to make sure with eco buffers, is that the long-lived species, like the white spruce, those ones need to be spaced adequately apart so that they'll have lots of room to grow and not compete with each other, and that your forest strip will have a lot of longevity to it. But yeah, those are the basic parameters, and otherwise we mixed a diversity of native species in and planted them densely, and the idea will be that those species will capture the site after just a few years. They'll fill in the gaps, and so that weeds can't grow underneath. So in this case, we went for this eco buffer design pattern. We left a little bit more spacing to allow for Brenda's equipment to get through, so the between row spacing is about 3 meters, still planting something every row on diverse native species, and then we left a 5-meter buffer between the outer row and the cropland, and seeded that to a ground cover of sheep fescue and white clover, something low growing. So that was the basic design that we followed here. All right, so once you've got your design sort of figured out, the next question is, like, you got to get stock for that design. You got to get plants that you're going to be planting. And for these kinds of projects, there's a few different options to consider. I actually have a couple of them over here. So typically, you can plant these sort of projects with cuttings. So this is a willow cutting here. You can plant them with rooted stock, like plug forms, like these spruce here. Or sometimes the rooted stock comes as a bare root as well, usually from nurseries. Or you can plant like seed, or some people plant transplants as well, but those are the three main kinds. For these kinds of projects, well, we're planting, it's a pretty large planting project. Across this farm, we're planting about 2,000 seedlings. And so cuttings are great, like DIY projects. And if you have a big group of volunteers, you can get them in quantities, but they do take a long time. And only certain species grow from cuttings. Willow, balsam poplar, and dogwood are really the best ones in field conditions here, the only ones that grow well in field conditions here. And so we have a fact sheet on how to plant these and harvest and plant these cuttings. So they are a great option. But for our project here that we're doing, we decided to go for mostly rooted stock we got from nursery. So these are little spruce seedlings. There's 15 in this bundle here. And the reason, yeah, for that, we can get them in a whole bunch of different species, get diversity, and they're quick to plant, much quicker. And so when you're getting these rooted stock like this, it's important to think about it well ahead of time, and ideally pre-order in the fall, because nurseries can run out. And typically you can think about planting them in Alberta. The main planting season is in mid-May to mid-June. And they'll ship them to you. The nursery will have grown them out the previous year typically. They'll freeze them over winter and bundle them up and then ship them to you like this. And sometimes they'll be frozen when they arrive. And then when you get them, it's important to let them to thaw out in cool conditions. Let them thaw out, and then plant them within a week of them being completely thawed. And just keep them nice and cool and stuff like that. And then, so that was what we used basically for this project, is this rooted stock for all of our trees and shrubs. And we also did use seed just for the herbaceous ground cover we seeded in. As I mentioned before, we seeded in a ground cover of sheep fescue and white clover just to fill in the space in between the rows and fill in the buffer. But those are the main types of stock we used. So in this video, I've covered how to develop a design for your planting project and how to source stock. And in the final video, we'll go into the actual implementation of the project. So the site preparation and the actual planting of it, and then maintaining it after planting.